Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you how I made this really cool little serving board with a spiral inlay using the CNC. Much easier than you think. Check it out. So starting out on this project, I'm using a scrap from a walnut slab. This is actually the same slab that I used on my dad's urn, if you've seen that video from a couple years ago. This was a top cut that I bought, and it had some interesting character on this kind of bottom section of the slab here. Now I'm running it through my planer, and it was a little bit tricky to get it through there because it really wasn't flat. I wasn't really looking to use like a flattening jig or anything. I just wanted to kind of quickly get it down to a usable condition. Now I'm going to be using my new CNC. This is a Tormach 24R, and you might be familiar with Tormach machines. They're typically, seen in more machinist style shops with their vertical milling machines, and they also have some lathe machines as well. So their CNCs are really robust, and I got this a couple months ago, and I've been sort of learning the ropes on how to use it, and I thought this would be a good project. Now this table on the CNC is actually a vacuum hold down table, but since this slab is pretty irregular, I'm using this little trick with some super glue and some painter's tape. So I put down some painter's tape on the wasteboard and some painter's tape on the bottom of the slab, and then I'm using some Starbond medium CA glue and some accelerator to just basically glue the board down. What's great about this is that the surface tension of the painter's tape keeps the piece perfectly in place, and the super glue acts as a permanent bond between the two pieces. And then when you're done, you can basically just peel it off the table, and there's no damage to the spoil board. Now I did all my designing for this in Vectric Aspire, which is a great program for CNC work like this, and then I bring it over into the Tormach's PathPilot software, and I get all my zeros set up and work through it. Now obviously this would be different with any CNC you're using, and on the Tormach it's really easy. I throw a 30-degree engraving bit in there, and then I use the little probe to measure off the distance of my workpiece and get this thing started. Now I chose to do this sort of light engraving pass on this slab because I want to be able to then go ahead and fill the engraving with some epoxy. I've done stuff like this before using super glue and mother of pearl and a couple different things, but I've been experimenting with some geometric patterns in Vectric, and I like this sort of overlapping circle pattern. And basically what I did was I took some circles and arrayed them out from the center, and I overlapped them by about 12 degrees, and then it kind of drew this nice sort of spiralized shape, leaving a section in the center that was supposed to be really intricate. Now the walnut didn't really work super well on that very, very fine part in the very center. You can see how it's kind of fuzzy. So I modified my tool path a little bit, and on my second pass here with a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit, I decided to sort of hog out a little donut in the center that I could then fill with epoxy, and it would just look a little cleaner than that kind of fuzzy section. Now when I'm doing the engraving pass, I don't usually use the dust collector, but on this heavier pass, I've got the little dust boot on there. And what's nice about this machine is that once I zero it, I can change the bit as many times as I want, and as long as I don't move the piece, the machine always knows exactly where it is. It references its X, Y, and Z axis, and it doesn't lose any steps along the way. So as long as I, draw the two tool paths in the same location, it's really easy for me to do multiple cuts with multiple different end mills. You can see how easy it is for me to break that bond of the painter's tape and the super glue, and I just have to cut a little bit of fuzz off the bottom of the serving board. Now, like I said, this is a top cut off of a slab, so there's a section on either side where you can see that sapwood that actually has bark on the bottom, and that's going to be important because I don't want to put any sort of handles on this little board, but I do want you to be able to pick it up. So I thought I would utilize that as a natural kind of handle grip section on these sides of the board. Now I'm going to be using Total Boat high performance epoxy and some white pigment inside this little engraving inlay. And I thought I would need this painter's tape around the edges to sort of keep it from pouring out, but the epoxy wound up being super thick, It's pretty cold in my shop, so it wasn't really flowing like water the way I thought it would, and I realized that I didn't really need it once I got started. I just put a little bit of white pigment in with my 2-part epoxy. I stir it up with this tongue depressor, and then I start pouring it down onto the board. I'm using the side of the little mixing stick to smear it into all those engraving marks, and it very quickly starts to fill up the areas and leave a really nice white line inside those 30-degree engraving marks. I engraved down about 60 thousandths of an inch, so 0.06, and it was just enough for me to get a little grab on the epoxy and not be so light that when I sanded it, I sanded everything away. So I took my time mixing up that epoxy and making sure I filled all the major gaps and just spread it around the board, making sure that I got it in all the different parts. And it's okay if it runs off the edge a little bit. I'll just sand it, which is, pretty easy because it's just a little light coat of epoxy squirting over the sides there. It's important that you fill all the gaps here because obviously you don't want to have to go back and remix any white epoxy. You want to make sure it's all consistent. And then I use a torch just to burn out any of the little bubbles. I let this dry for 24 hours. I come back the next day with the sander and I just start sanding down that sort of epoxy layer on top. I start with an 80 grit and I work my way up to a 220 on the top. And I also take this time to give the edge a pretty nice sized chamfer. I was going to run this through the router, but I thought it was a little more natural and it would actually work a little bit better because of that live edge section if I did it with the sander. You can see a little bit of the bark here on the back. You can see how quickly it flakes off with the 80 grit. And then I just take my knife and I skin off some of that loose bark on the bottom. And both of these sides are going to act as my little kind of handles. So when you go to pick this thing up off the table, there's something to grab it by. But there's also still a really large section that's fully supported on the bottom, so it's not going to tip over a rock or anything like that. So I do a pretty heavy round over on the bottom as well. And what's nice is, this little Mirka 6-inch sander with an 80 grit pad really does a lot of work. The dust collection is excellent, and it's easy to give like a nice consistent rounded corner with something like that. I want this thing to look consistently round from the top, so I'm pretty careful not to kill it on those really thin areas over on the sides. Once it's completely sanded, I decide I'm going to use a clear mineral oil. And what's nice about this is it's completely food safe. It does a really good job sealing in the wood. I use this finish all the time, and I basically just put it on pretty liberally. I let it soak in, and then I sort of hard buff it with a really clean rag, and it gives a nice sheen. It's really easy to reapply. You can keep putting it on as much as the wood will take. And again, it's food safe. It'll never spoil or get bad or anything like that, never smell. You can see the epoxy blended in really nice, and I can just buff in a nice finish. I give it some time to dry, and this thing is all done. Really happy with how it came out. It also spins pretty well. All right, that about does it for this video. I'm really enjoying using this new CNC from Tormach. This is a huge upgrade from the more kind of DIY CNC that I had before this. This is a serious unit, and I'm just skimming the surface, learning how to use Vectric and learning how to use PathPilot, which is the Tormach software that runs this machine. There's a lot that you can do with this, and there's a lot that I plan on doing with this in some future videos. Now, this thing is obviously super powerful and super rigid, and you can do some aluminum and brass work on this, which I'm really excited about. The other thing that I didn't use in this video is the vacuum table, and in one of my past videos, I made a little remote control setup for that, and since this slab wasn't totally flat on the bottom, it really wasn't conducive to the vacuum table, but there's some other cool stuff that I plan on using that for, and I'm really excited to show you guys what I'm going to do with this machine. So thank you very much to Tormach for hooking me up with this. If you're interested in the Tormach 24R and you've got the desire to kind of push your CNC router to the next level, check this thing out. There'll be some links down in the description on some more information on this machine. It's really cool. It ships fully assembled, which I thought was awesome. And you basically just, undo a couple of bolts, plug it in, and it's ready to go. It also uses the same programming language, the same conversational path pilot software that all the other Tormach machines use. So if you're familiar with Tormach and you've used any of their mills or lathes, something like this, you could just hop right into it and get moving. For me, it's been exciting to learn the path pilot software because eventually I want to get a CNC mill and a CNC lathe for this shop, and learning it here where the material's a lot more forgiving, working with woods and plastics, is going to help me a lot when I move over into metal, steel, aluminum, and titanium once I get those machines over in the machine shop. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. Thank you again to Tormach. There'll be links about this machine down there. And also thank you to Total Boat, #1 name in epoxy. Thank you guys for hooking me up with the awesome epoxy that I used on this and the pigment. There'll be some links for them down below as well. If you want to see what I'm doing day to day here in the shop, follow me here on Instagram at @MakeEverythingShop. I post every day behind the scenes what I'm doing, answer questions, and kind of take you along on the inside scoop as to the projects that I post here on YouTube. Hope everybody had a safe and happy holiday, and we will see you on the next video. Thanks.